Welcome to this journey into the shadows of forgotten history, where the line between documented fact and whispered legend becomes impossibly thin. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below telling us your location and whether you're brave enough to listen to this alone in the dark, or if you've wisely chosen the safety of daylight. Your story matters to our haunted community. Tonight, we travel back to the winter of 1888, to a place that no longer exists on any modern map. Silverpine Valley, Montana Territory, a settlement of approximately 200 souls nestled deep in the northern Rockies, accessible only by a single mountain pass that closed completely for 4 months each winter. The people who lived there were miners, loggers, fur trappers, and their families. Hardy folk who had chosen isolation over civilization, who preferred the company of wolves and bears to the crowded streets of eastern cities. But in December of 1888, something changed in Silverpine Valley. Something that would transform this obscure mining community into the subject of sealed government reports, suppressed newspaper articles, and hushed conversations that lasted for generations. The official records, what few remain, speak of a series of animal attacks. Tragic, certainly, but not uncommon in the wild territories of Montana in the late 19th century. Bears, mountain lions, wolf packs, driven mad by hunger. These were known dangers, yet the unofficial records tell a different story entirely. In the Montana Historical Society archives, buried beneath decades of accumulated documents, there exists a leather-bound journal. The name embossed on the cover is Rebecca Hartwell, and she identified herself as the settlement's physician and midwife. Her entries from December 1888 through February 1889 make for disturbing reading. Dr. Hartwell was a woman of science, educated at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, a rational mind in an era of superstition. And yet, in those winter months, her careful medical notations begin to fracture, her handwriting growing increasingly erratic as she documented injuries that defied her understanding of anatomy and animal behavior. The first victim was discovered on December 3rd, 1888. A trapper named Samuel Ortega found 300 yards from his cabin by his own hunting dogs, who refused to approach the body. The temperature that night had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Fresh snow had fallen, covering the ground in a pristine white blanket, and in that snow, leading away from Ortega's remains, were tracks. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood measured them personally. He recorded the measurements in his official report, 16 inches long, 7 inches wide, with claw marks extending another 3 inches beyond the toe impressions. The stride between prints measured 6 feet. For comparison, the largest grizzly bear track ever recorded in Montana measures 14 inches in length, and no grizzly bear, even standing on hind legs, maintains a 6-foot stride through deep snow. But here's what keeps historians awake at night. What transformed this from a curious historical footnote into something far more unsettling? Those tracks didn't remain animal tracks. Approximately 200 yards from Ortega's body, they changed. The 4-legged gait became 2-legged. The claw marks disappeared, and the prints that continued toward the tree line were unmistakably human. Barefoot human prints in 15-degree weather, in fresh snow, made by feet that, according to Blackwood's measurements, would have belonged to a man standing at least 7 feet tall. Samuel Ortega's body was transported to Dr. Hartwell's clinic. What she found during her examination would haunt her for the rest of her life, and what she wrote in her private journal, in entries she clearly never intended for public view, would eventually be dismissed as the ravings of a woman driven mad by frontier isolation. But we're going to read those entries anyway, because sometimes the things we dismiss as madness are simply truths too terrible to accept. To understand what happened in Silverpine Valley, we must first understand the world these people inhabited. 1888 was a year of transitions in the American West. The frontier was closing, the great cattle drives were ending, railroads were carving through territories that had known only Native American trails and wagon roads. Montana had achieved territorial status in 1864, but statehood remained 2 years away. It existed in a liminal space, no longer truly wild, not yet fully civilized. Silverpine Valley represented one of the last holdouts of that older, harsher frontier. The settlement had been established in 1881 following the discovery of a modest silver vein in the surrounding mountains. It was never a boom town like Butte or Virginia City. The silver deposits were sufficient to support a small mining operation, nothing more. By 1888, approximately 40 families called Silverpine home, along with a floating population of single miners, trappers and drifters who came and went with the seasons. The town consisted of a single dirt road, optimistically named Main Street, lined with rough-hewn log structures. There was Hutchinson's General Store, which also housed the post office. The Silver Pine Saloon, run by a former Confederate soldier named Jacob Thornton. Dr. Rebecca Hartwell's combination clinic and residence. A small schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, presided over by circuit preacher Elijah Moss, who visited once monthly during passable weather. And the sheriff's office, a 2-room building where Thomas Blackwood maintained order with a pragmatic mixture of frontier justice and remarkable patience. The winter of 1888 arrived early. The first significant snowfall came in late October, unusual even for northern Montana. By mid-November, the Yole mountain pass had become impassable. This was not unexpected. Every resident of Silverpine knew that winter meant isolation. Supplies had been stockpiled, firewood had been cut and stacked, livestock had been brought in closer to town. The community prepared to weather the cold months as they had every year before. But this winter brought something new: the Reinhardt family. Klaus Reinhardt had arrived in Silverpine in September, just ahead of the first snows. He came from somewhere in the German territories, Bavaria, he claimed, though his accent suggested regions farther east. He traveled with his 12-year-old daughter Anna, a quiet child who spoke almost no English. Reinhardt was a bear of a man, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with a thick black beard and hands scarred from hard labor. He told Sheriff Blackwood he was a miner by trade, experienced with both hard rock and placer operations. He carried letters of reference, though Blackwood later noted they were written in German, and thus impossible for him to verify. What struck people immediately about Klaus Reinhardt was his intensity. He rarely smiled. He kept Anna close, never allowing her to attend the schoolhouse with other children. He worked the hardest shift at the mine, the midnight to dawn hours that most men avoided, and returned to his small cabin at the edge of town to sleep through the day. He spoke little, drank less, and made no effort to integrate himself into the community's social fabric. "The German keeps to himself," Jacob Thornton wrote in a letter to his sister in Virginia, dated November 15, 1888. The letter was discovered in 1967 among a collection of Civil War correspondence donated to the Montana Historical Society. "Can't say I trust a man who won't take a drink or share a story. He watches folks the way a wolf watches sheep. His girl is scared of something, that's plain to see. She flinches at loud noises and won't meet anyone's eye. Makes you wonder what kind of life they ran." And from in the old country, the town's suspicion of Reinhardt was amplified by his arrival, coinciding with an unusual autumn. Animals behaved strangely. Dogs would bark at nothing, hackles raised, staring into empty forest. Horses spooked more easily than usual. Several trappers reported finding their trap lines raided not by bears, who hibernate, but by something that tore through steel jaws to reach the captured animals and then consumed them completely, leaving only blood-stained snow and scattered tufts of fur. Old Thomas Whitefeather, a Salish elder who lived alone in a cabin 5 miles north of town, came into Silverpine in early November with a warning. Whitefeather rarely visited the white settlement, preferring the solitude of his traditional hunting grounds, but Sheriff Blackwood recorded their conversation in his daily log. He told me his grandfather's grandfathers spoke of a creature that walked these mountains long before white men came, something that was both man and beast, cursed by broken taboos. He said the signs were present: unusual animal behavior, unexplained disappearances of game, a feeling of wrongness in the forest. He advised me to ensure all families kept their doors locked and their rifles loaded. He said the old ways of protection, silver, mountain ash, prayers to the old spirits, might be needed before winter's end. Blackwood, a practical man raised in Missouri, dismissed Whitefeather's warnings as superstition. He noted them in his log, but took no action. Dr. Hartwell, however, found herself thinking about the elder's words more than she cared to admit. In her journal she wrote, "I am a woman of science, yet I cannot shake the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong here. Perhaps it is merely the oppressive quality of this early winter, the way darkness falls so completely in these mountain valleys. Or perhaps instincts exist that predate education, primitive warnings that civilization has taught us to ignore at our peril." The community entered December with growing unease. The isolation was total now. No mail would arrive until spring. No circuit preacher, no traveling salesman, no contact with the outside world. They were alone with each other, with the bitter cold, with the endless pine forests that surrounded them on all sides. And then, on December 3rd, Samuel Ortega went to check his trap lines and never returned alive. Samuel Ortega's dogs found him first. More accurately, they found what remained of him. Martin Hutchinson, owner of the general store, was returning from his own trapline when he heard the howling. Not the usual baying of hounds on a scent, but something different, something wrong. He described it later as the sound of animals in mourning. Following the noise, he discovered Ortega's 3 hunting dogs, experienced animals, accustomed to bear and wolf, standing in a semicircle approximately 20 feet from their master's body. They would not approach closer. When Hutchinson tried to lead them forward, they planted their legs and pulled back with such force that one slipped its collar entirely and fled into the forest. Hutchinson had served in the Union Army. He had walked the field at Shiloh after the battle, had seen what cannon fire and bayonets could do to human flesh, but what he saw in that clearing, in the pristine snow under the pale December sun, made him vomit onto his boots before he could reach the tree line. Sheriff Blackwood arrived within the hour, accompanied by 4 men, including Klaus Reinhardt, who had been at the mine when word spread. Blackwood's official report, filed with the Montana Territory Marshal's Office, describes Ortega's condition in clinical terms. Victim found approximately 300 yards from his residence. Extensive trauma to the torso, throat and limbs. Appeared to have been attacked by a large predator, species unknown. Death likely occurred between 10 p.m. December the 2nd and 2 a.m. December 3rd, based on body temperature and blood coagulation, but Blackwood's private journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1903, tells a different story. "God forgive me, I have seen death in many forms, but never like this. Sam Ortega was torn apart, not bitten, torn. His ribcage was opened like a man cracks a lobster shell. Internal organs were missing. The throat was not bitten through as a predator would kill prey, but ripped away, leaving the spine exposed. And his face wore an expression of such terror that I ordered the men not to look at it directly. Whatever he saw in his final moments was not of this natural world." The tracks told their impossible story. Dr. Hartwell accompanied the party when they returned to document the scene more thoroughly. Her medical training included forensic examination, and she approached the evidence with scientific rigor, even as her hands trembled in the cold. She measured the tracks herself, confirming Blackwood's earlier measurements. She photographed them using her box camera, glass plate negatives that would later become some of the most studied and disputed images in cryptozoological circles. "The tracks begin as one would expect from a large quadruped," she wrote in her journal that night. "The depth of impression suggests an animal weighing between 400 and 600 pounds. The gait is consistent with a pursuit. The victim was running, and whatever pursued him was gaining ground rapidly. But then, approximately 200 yards from where Ortega fell, the tracks change. The transition occurs over the span of perhaps 3 or 4 steps. The rear paw prints elongate, the front paw prints fade, and then there are only 2 feet touching the ground. Human feet, or something very like them. The stride lengthens impossibly, and most disturbing of all, there's no evidence of the creature falling or stumbling during this transformation. It simply changed, while running at full speed through deep snow." Dr. Hartwell examined Ortega's body in her clinic, working through the night by kerosene lamp. Her official death certificate required for burial listed cause of death as massive trauma consistent with large animal attack. Her private notes, written in medical Latin perhaps, as a psychological shield against the horror of what she was documenting, paint a very different picture. The wounds were wrong. The bite radius was too wide for any known North American predator. The teeth, marks, and there were teeth marks, hundreds of them in the shredded flesh, showed characteristics of both carnivore and human dentition. The jaw that made those marks would have had to open to a width of nearly 14 inches. For comparison, the largest recorded bite radius for a grizzly bear is approximately 8 inches. But what truly disturbed Dr. Hartwell were the scratches, deep furrows in Ortega's flesh, made by claws that had partially retracted during the attack, a characteristic of cat family predators. Yet the claw marks showed thumb opposition. Whatever made those marks had opposable digits. It had grabbed Samuel Ortega with hands, even as it tore him apart with teeth and claws. "I find myself considering impossibilities," Dr. Hartwell wrote. "I'm reminded of medieval texts I encountered during my studies, descriptions of lycanthropic transformations dismissed by modern medicine as either fabrication or misidentification of hypertrichosis and porphyria patients. Yet here, before me, is evidence that defies rational explanation. The killer was simultaneously animal and human, or it was human and became animal, or—" She never finished that sentence. The community's reaction was immediate and divided. A town meeting was called that evening in the schoolhouse. Every adult in Silverpine attended, many bringing rifles despite Blackwood's request that they leave weapons at home. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and fear. Jacob Thornton spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of age and former military rank. "We all know what we're dealing with here. Those tracks don't lie. Something that walks on 4 legs and 2 legs isn't natural. And we all know who brought strangeness to this valley." Eyes turned to Klaus Reinhardt, standing at the back of the room with Anna pressed against his side. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, but whether from the meeting's hostile atmosphere or from her father's tightening grip on her shoulder, no one could say. "I know what you're thinking," Reinhardt said, his accent thick, his English halting. "The German stranger, he brings bad luck. He brings old country curses. But I tell you, I am not your enemy. I came here for work, for safety for my daughter. Whatever killed Samuel Ortega, it was not me." "Then explain the tracks," demanded Martin Hutchinson. "Explain how something changes from beast to man while running through snow. Explain the old stories, the European stories about men who become wolves under the full moon." "The moon wasn't full last night," Dr. Hartwell interjected, her voice calm but firm. "If we're going to discuss folklore, let's at least be accurate about it." "The moon was 3 days from full," Thomas Whitefeather said quietly from his seat near the stove. All eyes turned to him. "Close enough for old curses. The spirits don't consult almanacs, white woman. They follow their own calendar." Sheriff Blackwood raised his hands for silence. "We're not going to solve this with accusations and superstition. Starting tonight, I'm implementing a curfew. No one leaves their home after dark unless absolutely necessary. We'll organize patrols, armed men watching the streets in shifts. We'll post guards at the mine, the school, anywhere people gather. Whatever killed Sam Ortega, animal or man or something in between, we'll be ready for it next time." But there was a problem with Blackwood's plan, one that Dr. Hartwell realized as she walked home that night under a sky thick with stars. They were assuming there would be warning. They were assuming the killer would follow predictable patterns. They were assuming they could protect themselves with guns and vigilance. The second attack came 2 nights later, and this time there were witnesses. Now I want to pause here and ask you, what do you think is happening in Silverpine Valley? Is this a case of mass hysteria, a community seeing monsters in the shadows because they expect to find them? Is Klaus Reinhardt hiding something terrible about his past? Or is there truly something supernatural stalking these mountain valleys? Drop your theories in the comments below. Tell us what you think is really happening, because what comes next will challenge everything you believe about the boundaries of the possible. December 5th, 1888. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, the kind of cold that makes lungs ache with each breath, that turns exposed skin white with frostbite in minutes. Most of Silverpine's residents huddled inside, feeding their stoves through the long night, grateful for solid walls between themselves and whatever prowled the darkness outside. But the mine operated around the clock. Silver doesn't care about weather or fear. And the men who worked the midnight shift had bills to pay and families to feed. 6 miners descended into the earth that night. Klaus Reinhardt, his shift supervisor William Carson, and 4 others whose names would be recorded in company payroll records, but whose testimonies would later be sealed by territorial authorities. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the men heard something that didn't belong underground. A howling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the tunnels in a way that made it impossible to identify the source. William Carson would later describe it as the sound a man might make if he was trying to imitate a wolf but couldn't quite get it right. Too human to be animal, too animal to be human. The howling stopped, then came the screaming. Above-ground night watchman Patrick O'Sullivan was making his rounds when he heard it too. Not howling this time, but human screaming, coming from the direction of the mine shaft. He ran toward the sound, his lanterns swinging wildly, casting chaotic shadows across the snow. What he saw would haunt him for the remaining 32 years of his life. A figure emerged from the tree line approximately 50 yards from the mine entrance. In his official statement, O'Sullivan described it as a man, or something shaped like a man, but wrong in every proportion. 7 feet tall, perhaps more. Covered in what appeared to be hair or fur, though the darkness and distance made certainty impossible. It moved with a loping gait, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes dropping to 4, as if it couldn't decide which method of locomotion suited it better. The figure was dragging something, someone. Peter Holbrook was 23 years old, newly married, saving money to bring his wife west from Pennsylvania. He had been standing guard at the mine entrance, rifle in hand, when something had come out of the darkness and seized him. O'Sullivan watched, frozen in horror, as the creature dragged Holbrook across the snow with impossible speed. The young man's screams had faded to weak moans by the time O'Sullivan found his voice and began shouting for help. The miners emerged from underground, Reinhardt leading the way. By the time 6 armed men with lanterns reached the spot where O'Sullivan stood trembling, pointing toward the forest, the creature and its victim had vanished into the darkness. But the trail was unmistakable. Deep furrows in the snow where something heavy had been dragged. And blood. So much blood that the snow appeared black in the lamplight, a dark river leading into the forest depths. Sheriff Blackwood organized a search party immediately, 20 men armed with rifles, shotguns, and enough lanterns to light a church service. Dr. Hartwell insisted on accompanying them, despite Blackwood's objections. "If Peter Holbrook is alive, he'll need medical attention," she said firmly. "And if he's not, someone needs to document what was done to him." They found him an hour later, 3/4 of a mile into the forest, at the base of a massive pine tree that must have been growing when Columbus reached the Americas. What they found was not Peter Holbrook anymore. Not really. It was evidence. It was a message. It was a nightmare made flesh. The young man had been opened from throat to groin with surgical precision. His organs were arranged around his body in a pattern that several of the more superstitious men insisted was occult in nature. His heart was missing entirely, and carved into the flesh of his chest, using what Dr. Hartwell would later determine were claw marks formed with deliberate care, was a symbol. Dr. Hartwell sketched the symbol in her journal. Years later, a folklorist studying European werewolf legends would identify it as a medieval Germanic warning marker, used in Bavaria and Prussia to identify the locations of lycanthrope dens. It translates roughly to cursed ground. But here's what truly terrified the search party. Peter Holbrook's eyes were open, and according to 4 witnesses, including Dr. Hartwell and Sheriff Blackwood, those eyes were tracking movement. The young man had been eviscerated, his heart removed, left in 20 below weather for over an hour. By every measure of medical science, he should have been dead long before they found him. Yet his eyes moved, his lips trembled as if trying to form words. And when Dr. Hartwell knelt beside him, her medical bag already open, though she knew there was nothing in it that could help, she swore she heard him whisper a single word, "Reinhardt." Then Peter Holbrook died. Truly, finally, impossibly died. The search party returned to Silverpine at dawn, bearing Holbrook's body on a makeshift stretcher. The town square filled with silent residents, watching as their neighbors carried the evidence of something that should not exist. Klaus Reinhardt stood apart from the crowd, Anna clutching his hand, both of them pale as the surrounding snow. "He spoke your name," Sheriff Blackwood said, approaching the German miner. "Peter Holbrook's last word was your name. You want to tell me why a dying man would use his final breath to accuse you?" Reinhardt's jaw tightened. "I tell you already, I am not this thing. But yes, I know why he speaks my name, because I know what hunts us. I know because I have seen it before in the old country, and I come here to escape it." What Klaus Reinhardt revealed that morning, standing in the town square while his terrified daughter pressed her face against his coat, would later be documented in multiple sources: Blackwood's journal, Dr. Hartwell's notes, and a letter written by circuit preacher Elijah Moss, who happened to be trapped in Silverpine by the early winter, and witnessed these events firsthand. Reinhardt's village in the Bavarian forest had been destroyed 3 years earlier. Not by war or fire or disease, but by something the locals called Der Wechselbalg, the changeling, an entity that appeared human during daylight hours, but transformed under the influence of the nearly full moon into something that killed without reason or mercy. 17 people had died over the course of one winter. The local priest had performed exorcisms. Hunters had tracked it through snow. The town's elder women had laid out protections of silver and mountain ash. Nothing worked, because the creature was one of them. It lived among them, ate with them, worked beside them, and they couldn't identify who until it was too late. "My wife," Reinhardt said, his voice breaking. "My Elizabeth, she was the first to die, torn apart in our own bedroom while Anna and I sleep in the next room. We hear nothing, nothing. In the morning I find her, and I know this is not the work of wolves or bears. This is the old evil, the curse that my grandfather's grandfather spoke of in whispers." The village had eventually identified the creature, or thought they had. A young shepherd named Eric Wolf, who lived alone in the hills, whose strange behavior and occasional disappearances coincided with the attacks. They had hunted him, cornered him in a barn, and burned it to the ground with him inside. The attacks stopped. The village tried to return to normal. But Reinhardt knew better. He had seen Eric Wolf's body in the ashes, seen that it was whole, unburned, throat cut by a silver knife that someone had placed beside the corpse to make it look like the shepherder had been the monster. Someone had sacrificed Eric to hide their own curse, and whoever that someone was, they had watched Reinhardt carry Anna away from the village, had followed them across an ocean and half a continent. "The creature is here," Reinhardt said. "It follows me, or maybe it follows her." He looked down at Anna, who had begun to cry silently. "My daughter, she has gift. She sees things, knows things. In the old country, they would call her a seer. Maybe the curse wants her. Maybe it wants to stop her from revealing its identity. Or maybe," he paused, his face cracking with grief, "maybe it simply enjoys the hunt." Dr. Hartwell stepped forward. "Anna," she said gently, "can you understand me? Do you know who the creature is?" The girl looked up, her eyes red from crying, and nodded slowly. Then she pointed, not at any person in the crowd. She pointed toward the forest, toward the mountains beyond, where the morning sun had not yet reached, and shadows still ruled the earth. Sheriff Blackwood made a decision that would be debated by historians for decades afterward. Instead of waiting for the creature to strike again, he organized a hunting party. 30 men, the largest armed group Silverpine could muster, would enter the forest and track the thing to its lair. They would end this threat permanently, using whatever means necessary. Dr. Hartwell objected strenuously. "You're talking about hunting something you don't understand based on the word of a frightened child, and a man who admits his own village turned on innocent people in their fear. This is how witch trials begin. This is how we become the monsters we're trying to kill." But fear had taken root in Silverpine, and fear demanded action. The hunting party assembled on the morning of December 7th. They carried rifles loaded with standard ammunition, but also with bullets that Martin Hutchinson had spent the night crafting, lead mixed with every piece of silver the town could spare. Wedding rings melted down, candlesticks, coins, even the silver in Dr. Hartwell's medical instruments. Klaus Reinhardt led them into the forest, following tracks that only he seemed able to distinguish from the countless animal trails that crisscrossed the snow. Anna remained in town, locked in Dr. Hartwell's clinic, protected by the few men too old or infirm to join the hunt. The hunting party traveled deeper into the mountains than most had ever ventured. They passed landmarks the trappers knew, Old Growth Ridge, where trees had stood since before European arrival, the Deadfall, where a rockslide decades earlier had created a field of boulders the size of houses, the Whispering Caves, a series of limestone caverns that the Salish had long considered sacred ground. It was near these caves that they found the lair. The smell reached them first. Decay and musk and something else, something that made several men gag despite the freezing air. Then they saw the entrance, a fissure in the rock face, partially hidden by ice and overgrowth, wide enough for a man to enter if he turned sideways. Thomas Whitefeather stopped at the entrance and refused to go farther. "This is a bad place," he said flatly. "My people learned long ago not to enter certain caves. What lives here is older than your European curses, older than your Christian devil. You go in there, you may not come out as yourself. But Blackwood entered, and Reinhardt, and Martin Hutchinson, Jacob Thornton, and 16 others. Dr. Hartwell, who had followed the party despite being ordered to remain in town, entered last, her medical bag in one hand and a borrowed revolver in the other. What they found inside would appear in sealed government documents, in private journals never meant for publication, in letters written by men trying to explain to distant family why they could no longer close their eyes without seeing horrors. The cave extended far back into the mountain, its walls marked with the same symbol that had been carved into Peter Holbrook's chest. The floor was carpeted with bones, deer, elk, bear, and others that were unmistakably human. In a natural chamber, perhaps 50 feet underground, they found a living space. Furs arranged as bedding, tools fashioned from bone and stone, and a journal written in German, its pages stained with substances no one wanted to identify. Reinhardt picked up the journal with shaking hands. "I know this handwriting," he whispered. "This is God in heaven. This is Elizabeth's journal, my wife's journal. But how? She died 3 years ago. I buried her myself." Dr. Hartwell looked over his shoulder at the pages. The entries were dated, spanning from 1885 to just 3 days earlier. December 4th, 1888. The most recent entry was written in a mixture of German and what appeared to be much older language, possibly Old High German or even earlier dialects, but certain phrases were clear enough even to those who couldn't read German. Die Verwandlung ist fast vollständig. The transformation is nearly complete. Anna muss sterben. Anna must die. Dann wird der Fluch enden. Then the curse will end. Sheriff Blackwood was examining the furs used as bedding when he realized they weren't furs at all. They were pelts, human pelts, removed with terrible skill, still bearing recognizable features. He recognized the tattoo on one, a naval anchor, identical to the marking that Samuel Ortega had borne on his forearm. "Jesus Christ," Jacob Thornton breathed. "We need to leave. We need to leave right now and collapse this cave, seal it forever." But Klaus Reinhardt had found something else. A small wooden box, carefully carved with protective symbols. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a lock of blonde hair tied with a ribbon. A child's hair, and a photograph creased and faded, showing a woman who looked hauntingly like Anna, standing beside a much younger Klaus Reinhardt. "Elizabeth kept this," Reinhardt said, his voice hollow. "Our daughter's baby hair. She kept it to track her. Even in death, even transformed into this thing, some part of my wife remained. Some part still wanted to find Anna." That's when they heard it. A sound from deeper in the cave system. Not a howl or growl. Worse, much worse. It was humming, a lullaby, a German lullaby that Reinhardt recognized instantly, the same song Elizabeth had sung to Anna every night before bed. And it was getting closer. What happened next in those caves would never be fully documented. The hunting party fled, but not all of them made it out. 4 men were pulled back into the darkness, their screams cutting off with wet, final sounds. The survivors sealed the cave entrance with dynamite they had brought for precisely this purpose, bringing down half the mountainside in a roar that echoed across Silverpine Valley. But here's what Dr. Rebecca Hartwell recorded in her journal that night, writing by lamplight while her hands still shook. "I saw it. God forgive me. I saw the creature clearly in those final moments before the explosives detonated. It was no wolf. It was no bear. It was a woman, or what remained of one after years of transformation. Elizabeth Reinhardt, if that name still applied to the thing she had become. Her body was elongated, wrong in every proportion. Her face bore human features but distorted, the jaw extended, The teeth multiplied. Hair, fur, covered most of her body, but patches of bare skin showed through, marked with scars and symbols I recognized from medieval Germanic texts on cursed transformations. But worst of all were her eyes. They held intelligence, recognition. When she looked at Klaus, when she saw him standing there with the journal in his hands, those eyes filled with tears, human tears. She tried to speak, tried to form words with a mouth no longer capable of human speech, and what came out was half words, half howls. Anna, protect. Anna, curse. Passing. Then the charges exploded, and the mountains swallowed her screams. The hunting party returned to Silverpine with 4 fewer men than had left that morning. They carried Elizabeth Reinhardt's journal, the lock of Anna's hair, and the horrifying knowledge that they had been hunting not a monster from folklore, but a mother transformed into something monstrous, still trying in some twisted way to reach her daughter. But the nightmare wasn't over. Because that night, when Dr. Hartwell checked on Anna in the clinic's back room where the girl had been sleeping, she found the window open, the room empty, and tracks in the fresh snow leading toward the forest. 2 sets of tracks, one small, barefoot, child-sized, one larger, also barefoot, showing characteristics that made Dr. Hartwell's blood run cold. The transformation wasn't just Elizabeth's curse. It was hereditary, and Anna Reinhardt had finally reached the age where the change began. The official records state that Silverpine Valley was abandoned in the spring of 1889. The territorial government report cites economic factors and harsh winter conditions as reasons for the settlement's dissolution. The remaining residents dispersed to other Montana towns, and by 1892 Silverpine existed only as a notation on outdated mining surveys. Nature reclaimed what humans had built, and within a generation, no physical trace of the town remained visible to casual hikers. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. In 1953, a graduate student named Margaret Chen from the University of Montana was researching abandoned mining settlements for her thesis on frontier economics. While examining territorial records in the Helena archives, she discovered an anomaly. The death rate for Silverpine Valley during winter 1888-1889 was astronomically high. Of the approximately 200 residents, 37 deaths were recorded between December 1888 and March 1889. For context, the average death rate for similar-sized Montana settlements during the same period was 4 to 6 individuals. Chen obtained permission to visit the former settlement site. What she found there, documented in her field notes and photographs now housed at the Montana Historical Society, was disturbing. The foundations of buildings were still visible beneath decades of overgrowth, and in what had been the town square, she discovered something that shouldn't have existed. A mass grave, unmarked and unofficial, containing the remains of at least 20 individuals. The bodies were buried in a manner inconsistent with standard frontier practices, Chen wrote in her thesis. No coffins, no markers, no evidence of Christian burial rites. They were simply placed in a pit and covered with earth and stones. More troubling, several skeletons showed evidence of severe trauma. Broken bones, severed limbs, crushed skulls. These were not people who died of disease or exposure. These were people who died violently. Chen's discovery prompted a state investigation. Forensic analysis of the remains was limited by 1950s technology, but certain facts emerged. The bones dated to the late 1880s. Several showed tooth marks inconsistent with known scavengers, and one skeleton, that of a young female, approximately 12 years old, was found separated from the mass grave, buried alone beneath what had been the floor of the schoolhouse. This skeleton showed signs of both trauma and something else. The bones had been marked with symbols, carved post-mortem, that matched the protective sigils found in medieval European anti-lycanthropy texts. In 1967, a forest ranger named Daniel Kowalski was investigating reports of illegal hunting in the national forest that now covered the former Silverpine area. He discovered a cave system partially blocked by an old rock slide. Curious, he cleared enough debris to enter and found the remains of what appeared to be an early mining operation or living space deep underground. Among the artifacts Kowalski recovered were 3 items of particular interest. A child's doll, handmade with disturbing attention to detail, its face carved to show an expression of silent screaming. A silver locket containing 2 photographs, a woman and a young girl, both blonde, both bearing a family resemblance that suggested mother and daughter, and a leather journal, severely damaged by moisture and time, with entries in German and English. The journal was eventually translated and partially restored by specialists at the Smithsonian. While many pages were illegible, certain passages survived. They were written by Klaus Reinhardt, dated between December 1888 and February 1889. The entries that could be read told a story of desperate love and horrifying choices. December 10th, 1888. Anna is changing. I see it in her eyes, in the way she watches the moon even, through closed curtains. The curse that destroyed my Elizabeth now claims my daughter. I thought ocean and distance would break the hereditary chain, but I was wrong. Some curses are written in blood and bone. They cannot be outrun. December 18th, 1888. Dr. Hartwell has been kind, but she does not understand. She speaks of rabies, of mental illness, of things that science can explain. She has not seen Anna's hands elongate in the moonlight. She has not heard her daughter growl with a voice that is not human. She has not had to chain her own child in the cellar to protect the town. January 3rd, 1889. It is done. May God forgive me for what I have done. Anna begged me, in her moments of lucidity, to end her suffering. She knew what she was becoming. She knew that soon there would be no humanity left, only the beast. I used silver as tradition demands. I carved the protective symbols into her bones, as the old women of my village taught me. I buried her in the schoolhouse, the place she most loved to watch from our window, even though she could never attend. Perhaps in death she can finally be the child she never got to be in life. February 12th, 1889. I have told the town that Anna ran away, that she wandered into the forest and could not be found. They pretend to believe me. Everyone in Silverpine pretends now. We pretend that this winter was normal. We pretend that ordinary bears and wolves killed our neighbors. We pretend because the truth would destroy us more completely than any monster ever could. I leave tomorrow. There is nothing left for me here but memories of the 2 people I loved most in the world, both destroyed by a curse I cannot break. Sheriff Blackwood has agreed to help cover the truth, to seal records, to ensure that what happened here never appears in official histories. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. The journal ends there. Klaus Reinhardt was never heard from again. No death certificate, no burial. Record, no trace of his existence after he left Silverpine in February 1889. In 1981, an elderly woman named Dorothy Hutchinson contacted the Montana Historical Society with a box of letters and photographs that had belonged to her grandfather, Martin Hutchinson, the store owner who had discovered Samuel Ortega's body. Among these items was a photograph that stopped historians in their tracks. It showed a group of men standing in front of the Silverpine General Store, dated March 1889. Most faces were blurred by the long exposure time required for photography in that era, but one face was crystal clear. Klaus Reinhardt, standing at the edge of the frame, staring directly into the camera with eyes that seemed to reflect light, like an animal's eyes caught in lamplight. But here's what made the photograph impossible. Klaus Reinhardt had supposedly left Silverpine in February. Multiple accounts confirmed his departure. Sheriff Blackwood's journal noted seeing him board the supply wagon for the last time on February 15th. Yet here he was, captured on film a month later. And if you looked very closely at his hands, hanging at his sides, you could see something that several forensic photographic analysts would later confirm. The fingers were too long, the nails were more like claws, and the proportions were subtly wrong in ways that suggested the man in the photograph was not entirely human. Dorothy Hutchinson included a note with the photograph. "My grandfather never spoke about that winter in Silverpine. But before he died in 1932, he told me one thing. He said that some curses can't be killed. They can only be passed on. He said Klaus Reinhardt understood this. And he said that somewhere in the Montana wilderness, the curse still walks, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge again." The final piece of evidence came to light in 1986 when a team of anthropologists studying Native American historical sites in northern Montana interviewed the grandson of Thomas, Whitefeather. The elderly Salish man shared stories passed down through his family, including one about the winter the white town invited the old curse to their doors. According to these oral histories, the creature that haunted Silverpine was not originally European. It was far older, a cursed entity that the first peoples of the region had sealed in the mountain caves with ceremonies and sacrifices. When European settlers arrived, bringing their own folklore of werewolves and shapeshifters, they had unknowingly weakened those ancient seals. And when Klaus Reinhardt came to Silverpine, fleeing his wife's transformation, he brought with him a hereditary curse that resonated with and awakened the older entity. "The two curses became one," the grandson explained. "Like calling to like, my great-grandfather said this would happen. He said the white people's stories and our people's warnings were describing the same evil, just in different languages. And when that evil found a family, already marked by transformation, it could finally take physical form again." The anthropologists pressed for more details, but the old man would say only one more thing. "My great-grandfather performed a ceremony before he died. He said it would hold the curse for 7 generations, but 7 generations are almost finished now. And I have seen tracks in the mountains again, tracks that change from 4 legs to 2. So perhaps it's time for a new warning. Perhaps it's time for people to remember what waits in those mountains and why certain places should remain abandoned." So what really happened in Silverpine Valley during the winter of 1888? To this day, no one knows the truth. Not definitively. Not with the kind of certainty that allows us to close the book and move on. What we have instead are fragments, photographs that shouldn't exist, journals written by people who saw impossible things, bones that tell stories modern science still struggles to explain. We have 3 primary theories, each supported by some evidence, each contradicted by other facts. Let's examine them. Theory 1. Mass hysteria and rational explanations. Some historians argue that Silverpine Valley experienced a perfect storm of circumstances that created collective delusion. An isolated community trapped by winter, already suspicious of foreign newcomers. A series of genuine animal attacks, perhaps by an unusually large grizzly bear or a rabid wolf pack, that were misinterpreted through the lens of European folklore that Klaus Reinhardt had inadvertently introduced. The strange tracks could be explained by overlapping animal prints in melting and refreezing snow. The wounds on victims, while severe, fell within the range of damage large predators can inflict. Dr. Rebecca Hartwell's increasingly erratic journal entries could indicate the psychological breakdown of an intelligent woman pushed past her limits by frontier isolation and repeated trauma. Klaus Reinhardt's confession about his wife and daughter might have been the delusions of a grieving man suffering from guilt-induced psychosis. The community, desperate for explanations and someone to blame, created a monster narrative that justified their xenophobia and explained their losses. This theory is neat, scientific, rational. It accounts for most of the documented facts without requiring belief in the supernatural. But it doesn't explain the photograph from March 1889. It doesn't explain the symbol carved into Peter Holbrook's chest, matching medieval European occult markers that no one in Silverpine should have known. And it certainly doesn't explain the tracks that forest rangers and hikers continue to report in that region. Tracks that change from four-legged to two-legged, just as they did in 1888. Theory 2. Hereditary lycanthropy. The second theory takes Klaus Reinhardt's story at face value. There exists, or existed, a genuine curse, biological, supernatural, or some combination of both, that could transform humans into predatory creatures. The Reinhardt family carried this curse in their bloodline, perhaps for generations. Elizabeth Reinhardt, transformed first, either dying in Bavaria and somehow being resurrected as the creature that followed her family to America, or never fully dying at all, but existing in a state between life and death. Anna Reinhardt inherited the curse. Her transformation began at approximately 12 years old, triggered by approaching puberty and proximity to the nearly full moon. Klaus Reinhardt, faced with losing his daughter to the same horror that claimed his wife, made the agonizing choice to end her life before the transformation became complete. This theory explains the coherent narrative in the surviving documents. It explains why the attack stopped after Anna's death. With both curse carriers eliminated, the threat was neutralized. It explains the protective symbols and silver bullets, traditional defenses against lycanthropy that the community employed. But this theory raises as many questions as it answers. If Klaus Reinhardt carried the curse in his bloodline, why didn't he transform? Why did it affect only the women in his family? And if the curse was eliminated in 1889, what explains the continued sightings and evidence that emerged decades later? Theory 3. Something much older. The third theory, supported primarily by Native American oral histories and certain anthropological evidence, suggests that what happened in Silverpine Valley was not the arrival of a European curse, but the awakening of something that had always been there. An entity that predated both European and Native American presence, something so ancient that both cultures had developed their own folklore to explain it. This entity lay dormant in those mountain caves, sealed by rituals and barriers that white settlers didn't recognize or respect. When Klaus Reinhardt arrived, carrying his own family's dark history, the resonance between his curse and the ancient entity created a perfect storm. The two horrors merged, fed off each other, manifested in physical form. This theory explains why the protective measures only partially worked. You cannot kill what is not truly alive. You cannot seal what exists in multiple forms simultaneously. The best you can do is contain it, weaken it, buy time for future generations. And according to this theory, that time is running out. 7 generations have passed since Thomas Whitefeather performed his ceremony. The warnings are emerging again. The tracks appear with increasing frequency. Hikers vanish in those mountains, their disappearances attributed to falls, animal attacks, or simple misfortune. But the locals know better. The few remaining families who remember the old stories, who preserve the warnings passed down through generations, they know that Silverpine Valley was never truly abandoned. Something still lives there. Something still hunts there. Something that walks on 4 legs and 2 legs, that remembers the taste of human flesh and the thrill of the hunt. To this day, if you visit the national forest that covers the site of old Silverpine Valley, and I strongly advise against it, you'll find that local guides refuse to take hiking groups into certain areas. The official explanation is unstable terrain and dangerous wildlife. But if you press them, if you ask directly, Some will tell you the real reason. There are places in those mountains where animals refuse to go, where birds don't sing, where the forest itself feels wrong in ways that defy explanation. And if you're foolish enough to go anyway, if you venture deep into those mountain valleys on a night when the moon is nearly full, you might hear something that stops your heart. Not a wolf's howl, not quite human screaming, something in between. Something that sounds like a woman singing a lullaby in German, her voice carried on wind that smells of decay and old blood. But you won't stick around to investigate. No one ever does. Because somewhere deep in your primal brain, in the ancient instincts that predate civilization and logic, you'll know with absolute certainty that something is hunting you. And you'll run, just as Samuel Ortega ran, just as Peter Holbrook ran, just as dozens of others ran across more than a century. And if you're lucky, you'll make it out of those mountains before whatever hunts there catches your scent. Now it's your turn. What do you believe happened in Silverpine Valley? Do you think this was mass hysteria, a genuine supernatural curse, or something else entirely? Drop your theories in the comments below. And if you've ever experienced something in the Montana wilderness that you couldn't explain, share your story with our haunted community. We want to hear from you. If this deep dive into forgotten American horror has intrigued you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We have more lost histories waiting to be unearthed, more buried truths that demand investigation. Next time, we'll explore another corner of America's dark past, another story that official records tried to erase, but that refuses to stay dead. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, but most importantly, stay safe. Some mysteries are best left unsolved, some mountains are best left unclimbed, and some winters it's wise to lock your doors and wait for spring. This is the end of our journey into Silverpine Valley. Thank you for joining me in the darkness. I'll see you in the next investigation.